Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to look at the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, also often referred to as Ike, between 1952 and 1960. So this is largely aimed at helping A-level history students who are doing the specification from AQA to Q, the American Dream, Reality and Illusion, 1945 to 1980. And we're looking at this particular section: Eisenhower, Tranquility and Crisis, 1952 to 1960, the presidency, Eisenhower's personality, and the policies of dynamic conservatism, Nixon as vice president, the Republican Party, and the end of McCarthyism. So to try and make sure you've got everything you need for your studies and your revision, I'm going to cover all of those different aspects of this important bullet point from the spec. To start off with, we're going to look in some depth at Eisenhower's personality and his history, really. So Dwight D. Eisenhower, was most commonly called Ike, was the 34th president of the US and was the first Republican president for 20 years. He was born in Texas but raised in Kansas. He had quite an interesting upbringing, did Eisenhower. One of the most noticeable things about his upbringing was how religious his family was, and his mother actually went on to become a Jehovah's Witness, and although Eisenhower himself, despite having very strong religious beliefs, never quite identified with a particular group in that same way. He was trained at West Point. There was a whole bit of going back and forth. Both him and his brother couldn't both afford to go to fund university at the same time, or sort of kind of take it in years. His brother had done a couple of years. And Eisenhower was working and trying to build up the money for them both, but then saw this other route through a friend and going into the military, and so went into West Point. Wasn't a massively outstanding student at West Point, but progressed through and went on to become a 5-star general in the Second World War, and so the supreme commander of the Allies in Europe, and then the supreme commander of NATO. So he goes on to have a kind of very, very illustrious military career, and most famously played an absolutely key role in victory in Europe, notably the D-Day landings, and then the push through Western Europe. He was a latecomer to politics. In fact, it said that he'd never even actually voted until 1948. Truman had tried to get him to become a Democrat candidate in 47 and 51, and he'd refused. And he was persuaded instead by a group of friends and colleagues who were in the Republican Party to run for them in 1952. General George Patton, a friend of Ike, said in 43, "Ike wants to be president so badly you can taste it." So perhaps he was calculating his best chance. So maybe we should not read his earlier history as a complete apathy towards politics, but rather him biding his time and working out what was the best route to him to power and to the presidency. One of the things that's interesting in this, in that he is kind of deciding between the two parties, is that one of the bits we'll come back to is he doesn't seem to have a strong party affiliation, and therefore his actions are often bipartisan. He's often across the two parties, which is going to prove to be very helpful for him, because he's going to be president in a time when the Republican Party itself isn't doing brilliantly well in Congress. So bits we know about him, we know that he loved to be liked and hated to be disliked. He was always very careful never to openly speak ill of others, as he disliked being spoken ill of himself. He was brilliant at public relations, and this is shown during the war by his ability to get the Allies or the different armies to act as one. He continued this skill into his presidency, where he proved to be enormously popular. So Eisenhower, maybe his greatest gift was the gift of being liked. So he was liked when he was in the army, and this helped him do a really good job. He was liked when he was in the presidency, and this helped him get things done, particularly acting with Congress in situations which most presidents would have found nigh on impossible. As a military commander, he displayed empathy for his men, and again, this is something that we see in his time in politics, where he shows great empathy for the those less well off in America and trying to help those who need it. He coped well with pressure, was an excellent organizer, and had a really keen eye for detail, but didn't get bogged down in that detail. He was very, very confident. His critics would say arrogant. He favoured states' rights over federal activism. This might be one of the ways that led him to the Republicans rather than the Democrats. He aimed to balance the federal budget. Truman's budget had been at $14 billion deficit, and that is said to have been one of the reasons why Eisenhower decided to run in '52. He was focused very strongly on foreign policy. Again, that may be unsurprising given his earlier roles in the army during World War II and at NATO. And again, one of the reasons it's argued he ran in '52 was the possibility of the strongly isolationist Robert Taft becoming the Republican candidate and winning the presidency for the Republicans. So he disliked the spending of the Democrats. He disliked the isolationism of the Republicans, and so he decided to run himself, chose the Republicans, and to find essentially some kind of middle ground. In his personal life, he was married to Maine Dowd, who was from a wealthy family. They had 2 sons, very sadly one of whom died aged 3 of scarlet fever. His son John had 4 children. Amongst them was David, after whom Camp David, the presidential retreat, got its name. David then went on to marry the daughter of Richard Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president, and Nixon himself later went on to become president himself. Now, Eisenhower was seen as a man of many different interests. So he was a keen golfer. He had putting greens and things put in at the White House. Later in life, he was an oil painter. Throughout his army career, he was renowned as a skilled card player, in particular in card game bridge. And it is said that promotions under him in the army were said to be in part dependent on the ability to play a good game of bridge. So we can see that he's quite an interesting character who had lots of different interests. The 2 elections in '52 and '56 were absolute landslides for Eisenhower. Both were run against the Democrat candidate Stevenson. I often find it quite bizarre that Stevenson ran against him twice, having done so badly in '52. But it seemed in '56 he seemed completely unbeatable, and there weren't many Democrats lining up to take him on. Eisenhower chose Richard Nixon as his running mate to balance out his own lack of political experience, and also to help him see off Taft in the primaries, as Nixon was popular amongst the old guard in the Republican Party, a part of the party that Eisenhower himself found it difficult to reach. Eisenhower ran a K1C2 campaign attacking Truman's record on Korea, communism, and corruption. So K1 for Korea, C2 communism and corruption. The last one was made a little bit harder by the fact that Nixon got caught up in a corruption scandal for improperly receiving money from a secret trust, something Nixon took his way out of, and we'll have a look at that later. Largely, he used his family dog as his way out of that one. Another issue in '52 was Eisenhower failing to defend General George C. Marshall against conspiracy theories of McCarthy. Again, we'll look at McCarthyism a little bit later on, particularly the end of McCarthyism. But McCarthyism was this kind of paranoia led by Senator McCarthy about communists being everywhere and infiltrating the government and the army and subverting America, and how communism must be removed. Though he never actually had very much, if any, concrete evidence, but it created a great kind of hysteria in America at the time. So a bit more detail on these electoral victories. I said they were absolute landslides. We'll look at some of the numbers in a minute. One of the things that's noticeable in '56 is that Eisenhower had a major heart attack in '55. Nixon had to take over for 6 weeks. But again, we saw him come back with a great victory towards the end of his first term. He'd also dealt with the Suez crisis and events in Hungary fairly effectively. and his showing in 56 was bolstered by the economic performance of America 52 to 56, where there'd been a boom and people were feeling better off. So in 52, he was helped by the unpopularity of Truman. In 56, he was helped by a lot of the successes of his own administration and the economy in the 4 years he'd been in. And there might well be a degree of kind of public sympathy as well, given his health issues that he'd had in 55. So let's look at some of the numbers. So in 52, Eisenhower won 442 electoral college votes, Stevenson only 89. Eisenhower in that election won 34 million votes, Stevenson only 27 million. And then we see a similar thing in 56. In fact, Eisenhower does him better, Stevenson does even worse. So 457 electoral college votes in 56 to Stevenson's 73, 35.5 million votes to Stevenson's 26 million votes. So we see through this, Eisenhower becomes more popular going into his second term, wins by an even bigger margin. As I said, one of the things that's just fairly confusing on that is why the Democrats would run Stevenson against him twice. Having done badly the first time, does even worse the second. The only places where Stevenson was winning was in a number of the old Confederate states in the South. And this seemed to be the last part of America where the Democrats held sway when it came to presidential elections, though their support was much broader than that when it came to congressional elections. And the Republicans simply did not match Eisenhower's success in Congress. They won the House in 52, but lost it in 54, and failed to win it back. And in 58, they had only 153 seats compared to the Democrats' 283. And it's a similar story in the Senate, where they narrowly won the Senate in 52, but then lost control of it in 54. Then their worst showing is in 58, when there were only 34 seats compared to 64 Democrats. So in this, any success that Eisenhower has in getting anything through Congress is going to be quite remarkable, because he has 2 years of united government at the beginning, and then he has divided government for the entirety of the rest of his term. And not only divided government, but a government where his own party is a very small minority in both the House and the Senate. Now, the policies that were pursued by Eisenhower are referred to as dynamic conservatism. Now, he said that he was conservative when it comes to money, but liberal when it comes to human beings. The first part of this fitted with the Republican ideology generally, where the idea of being conservative with money. The second part, far less so, and led to Eisenhower expanding the welfare state, something that and other measures, some of which were not hugely popular amongst his Republican colleagues. He was, according to some stories, although he may have been liberal towards human beings, wasn't particularly liberal towards squirrels. And there's a story where Truman had fed the squirrels. Eisenhower had like a golf course built. The squirrels kept burying their nuts on his greens. He didn't like it, wanted them all shot. But instead, the Secret Services squirreled them away into local parks, and so avoided shooting them. So very liberal attitude towards people, maybe less so towards squirrels. So on the conservative part of when it came to money, Eisenhower wanted a balanced budget. However, he would intervene in the economy to stimulate growth. So in this, he seemed to be taking his lead with the popular policies of the New Deal under Roosevelt. So again, the first part of this, the balanced budget, fits with Republican ideology. The second bit, where you intervene and stimulate the economy, far less so. And he had a whole range of policies that fitted with this idea of dynamic conservatism. These included a massive highway building program funded by the federal government. This policy led to 41,000 miles of interstate highways being built over the next 20 years. This created employment and staved off unemployment, particularly when defense spending was dropped or cut following the Korean War. And it stimulated economic growth across the country, because not only was the interstate highway system was not only this creating jobs and people were getting work through building it, obviously it improved transport and communication between the different areas of America, and therefore stimulating the economy in that way as well. He created the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, and this did a whole range of important things. Through his term, we see the distribution of polio vaccines. We see the expansion of national parks with added amenities and visiting centres in these parks as well. We see a couple of really massive ones. Next year, we see the expansion of Social Security to over 10 million Americans and the increase of minimum wage by 25%. So both of these would be seen completely at loggerheads with the old guard in the Republican Party, who would not see Social Security in a positive light, in particularly expanding it to 10 million Americans, and definitely would see the increase of the minimum wage by 25% as something that was contrary to the ideas of the free market. Eisenhower also invested $500 million in low-income public housing. He pushed for more school buildings and building of more schools, but failed to provide the federal funds needed for this. The 58 National Defense Education Act can be seen as being highly significant, as through this he introduced the idea of direct federal money going into education. He also continued Truman's free school meals for the poorest students. Possibly most surprising of all amongst Eisenhower's policy particularly given his earlier career as a leading general, was that he sought to control and reduce defense spending. Again, something that wouldn't necessarily fit, you would think, with the overall ideology. Eisenhower was a very popular president with approval ratings over 70% through a lot of his presidency and comfortably over 50% throughout it. This is in stark contrast with Truman, who preceded with him, and for all the presidents in the time period we're going to look at up until 1980 that followed him, apart from Kennedy, whose presidency was very short-lived. So Eisenhower is really remarkable in terms of his popularity, and that would suggest that his policy of dynamic conservatism was also really popular. Johnson, Lyndon Johnson would go on, who goes on later to be vice president for Kennedy and then president himself, was the key figure Democrat in the Senate, and he saw kind of following Eisenhower's policies as the right move to make because Eisenhower was so popular. The popularity didn't rub off from Eisenhower to the Republican Party. People liked Ike, but not the Republican Party, and therefore his policies can be seen as being more in line with moderate Democrats. Some Republicans criticized him for not rolling back more of big government, whilst Democrats criticized him for not doing enough to help the people, especially over civil rights, though he did pass 2 civil rights bills in 57 and 60, and we'll look at civil rights during this period in a later video. However, one of the things that's really key, and the two bits do link in a strong way as well, is that a quarter of the US population still lived in poverty. So we're going to look again in a later video. I'm going to look at the kind of rising living standards and things like that during this period, but it didn't apply to all Americans. This next bit is really, really remarkable. Only 10 of the 83 bills that Eisenhower sent to Congress failed. Now, given the fact that not only was government divided for all but 2 years of his presidency, that at times there were just astronomical majorities for the Democrats in Congress, for him to manage to pass this high level of bills, something that you just wouldn't see, for example, in the modern day, it just shows his effectiveness in terms of bipartisanism. In fact, it went almost the other way at times, where actually he received more support from Democrats than he did Republicans. Another interesting bit with Eisenhower, in terms of something that does really, one of the few bits really that remains from him in shaping the Republican Party going forward, is Eisenhower connected religion to the presidency in a new way and connected religion to the Republican Party in a new way. He invited the evangelist preacher Billy Graham to the White House on numerous occasions. His administration added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and made "In God We Trust" a national motto. And this link that he starts building between the Protestant Church, particularly Protestant evangelism, and the Republican Party has remained all the way through to the modern day. Next, looking at Nixon as vice president. Well, Nixon had earned himself the name Tricky Dicky even before he became Eisenhower's running mate. He was almost dropped over accusations of pocketing $18,000 of political donations. He appeared on TV and used the story of his family being gifted the dog Checkers to win the public over and get himself out of trouble. So it's quite a remarkable bit of. Nixon was quite a skilled debater and public speaker, and he kind of twists the whole thing and kind of, well, look, this guy, you're complaining about people giving me things. We were gifted, this guy in Texas sent us this dog, and I've got young kids, and they fell in love with the dog. And I was like, well, one thing we weren't ever going to do was give that back. What do you expect of me? Everyone went, oh, he's got a dog and family, isn't he lovely? And it was all okay. Obviously, the trickiness of Nixon will return later. Whilst Eisenhower was maybe not the most committed Republican, Nixon absolutely was, and therefore one of the things he does is he connects the administration to the Republican Party. He can be seen as the first modern vice president. He chaired cabinet and National Security Council when Eisenhower was absent. He travelled very widely, acting as a goodwill ambassador, doing some good work, but also, again, in a very Nixon way, being very mindful of the press reaction to the trips and the press coverage that brought him back in the US and how he could use these trips to bolster his own and the administration's popularity. There was one trip where he faced real danger when he was in Venezuela, and this led to Eisenhower launching what he called Operation Poor Richard, something that absolutely drove Nixon up the wall, where again U.S. naval presence was used to ensure the Venezuelan authorities did everything could to restore order and make sure that Nixon was safe after a rather hairy incident where his convoy was set upon. So Nixon actually acted as president for 6 weeks when Eisenhower had a heart attack. Eisenhower faced other health issues, including a stroke, and spoke how he would always be very confident of Nixon stepping in and taking place. And there was no power grab. And Nixon acted very, very responsibly when given that opportunity. Nixon and Eisenhower didn't always see eye to eye. They clashed over tone, especially when Nixon launched partisan attacks on Truman's foreign policy. Eisenhower didn't believe foreign policy should be brought into partisan politics, and on Southern Democrats, which Eisenhower pointed out were kind of natural allies of the Republican Party. So Nixon played the partisan game, and Eisenhower essentially saw himself above it and tried to avoid it. This kind of political skill was actually quite important in the administration because Nixon was able to smooth out relationship between Eisenhower and the old guard of the Republican Party in Congress. Because although Eisenhower was getting Democrats to vote with him, there was a risk that he would lose all support from the Republican Party. Nixon managed to keep a degree of that. Interestingly, Nixon was a close friend with McCarthy, of McCarthyism, and he tried to restrain him and stop him from damaging the administration. But this was not completely successful, and we'll see a bit in a minute about the fall of McCarthyism. Nixon was a civil rights advocate, far more so than Eisenhower, and displayed views that were particularly liberal for this point in time. Again, one of the things, and later in the series, I'll look at Nixon's presidency, and obviously the lens we look at Nixon through is always clouded by the Watergate scandal and I'm not a crook and all that kind of stuff at the end. And so lots of people always question Nixon's a kind of slippery political operator, and so people often question his motives and wonder whether this kind of very liberal view on civil rights was something that he believed would win him and the party votes rather than a genuine belief. It's difficult to tell, but again, you need to make your own minds up on that and decide whether you see this as a political move or give him a benefit of the doubt. So the Republican Party as a whole, as discussed earlier, the Republican Party did not share Eisenhower's popularity through this, and we've talked about their trials and tribulations in Congress. I've also talked about how Eisenhower was not interested in partisan politics. Now, one of the problems with this is he failed to embed actually his philosophy of dynamic conservatism across the Republican Party. He didn't work closely enough with activists to make sure that this political philosophy of his kind of really embedded and took over. And what we see after him is a notable shift to the right, first of all to Nixon, which maybe is a jump, and there's not the whole of the jump. The following jump is then to Goldwater, who was a kind of a really right-wing candidate who ran in '64 and lost very badly to Johnson. As I mentioned earlier, the '58 results in Congress were particularly bad. At this point, Eisenhower was aging and in poor health. There was a recession. The Republicans were divided between those more moderates who supported Eisenhower and the old guard who wanted to move further to the right. And that there seems to be a kind of lack of strong candidates amongst the Republican Party at this point. And Democrat dominance, particularly in Congress, looked like it was there to stay. And obviously we're going to see, following Eisenhower, we're going to see Kennedy and then Johnson in the White House. Eisenhower clashed with a lot of the Republican Party over foreign policy, particularly his positive take on NATO versus their negative take. Him wanting to stand by the Yalta Agreement, whilst they wanted to pull back from it. Him seeking more friendly Soviet-American relations, and the kind of the old guard of the Republican Party pushing the kind of fear of communism and moving away and opposing the Soviets. There was even the Bricker Amendment, which, if it hadn't been defeated, would have substantially reduced presidential power over foreign policy. But it fell largely because of the intervention of Johnson and moderate Democrats in the Senate. Eisenhower saw a clash with the Republican Party on domestic policy. Eisenhower's failure to remove New Deal legislation was unpopular with the old guard of the Republican Party, as were his refusal to cut taxes further, having cut them in '54. Farming subsidies and social security measures passed with the support with Democrats rather than Republicans, and Lyndon Johnson often proved to be Eisenhower's key ally in Congress. The old guard saw Eisenhower not doing enough to investigate communists in government. He avoids direct confrontation with McCarthy, but we do see McCarthyism fail, and maybe that then becomes less of an issue. On that note, let's have a look at the end of McCarthyism. So McCarthyism was this paranoia about communists in government and the military, and it continued from the era of Truman into the era of Eisenhower. Eisenhower feared directly confronting McCarthy, fearing this could be damaging to his popularity. And McCarthy's claims were widely accepted despite any proof. Imagine a leading Republican politician making unfounded claims and receiving widespread support for them. It's completely unimaginable in the modern day. So Eisenhower, in a way, you could criticize and say that, well, maybe he should have done more. Even in the time of when he was coming into power, he should have taken on McCarthy directly. He failed to do it. However, it doesn't take long. In '54, we see the Army McCarthy televised hearings. McCarthy was investigating what he believed to be communist subversives on New Jersey Army bases. Eisenhower refused access to personnel and records on the basis of national security, which then essentially left McCarthy with no evidence. He pursued the hearings anyway. Lyndon Johnson made sure they were televised. He had a very good relationship with the media. McCarthy, on many occasions, appeared to be drunk during these hearings. It was all bluster and bullying, and he just lost public support. Following these, the Senate finally censored him for, amongst other things, abuse of members of congressional committees, acting against the ethics of the Senate, and bringing it to dishonor and disrepute. And the Senate voted overwhelmingly to censor him. McCarthyism now became McCarthyism, which was a little play on words that was used at the time. And McCarthy's political career at this point then just collapses. And all the publicity and support he'd been getting all just vanishes. and sadly he died not much longer after this, in 57, aged just 48. His death is connected again with alcoholism and heavy drinking. I hope that's all been really helpful for you. If it has been, then please hit like. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. If you haven't done so already, please do subscribe to Alan History Nerd. There's loads of videos on lots of different history units on here. So there's history units, whole coverage of whole units like the Tudors and Tsarist and Communist Russia on here, as well as other bits of American history, the American Civil War period, for example, and there's some modern Britain on there, and there's also tons and tons of politics, both UK and US politics, particularly helpful if you're doing A-level politics, and also I've just started some stuff on ancient history as well. So loads and loads on there, which hopefully you'll find interesting. And obviously, if you subscribe, you'll get notifications as I add more videos. And if you're doing this particular unit, then that might be another really useful thing to do. Thank you very much for watching.